All right. So, thank you. So first, just briefly introduce yourself, who you are, name, and basically what you do.
So my name is Andrew Morrison. I'm a PhD economist, and my job is the chief of the Gender and Diversity Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. And what we do here is design development projects that try and promote the equality of women in the Americas and the Caribbean. We also work on indigenous peoples issues and with African descendants.
All right. First question, which I'm asking everyone, is how do you define a woman? What do you think? What is the definition of woman being?
For me, the definition of a woman is a biological definition. A woman has a different set of chromosomes than a man has. And I make a strong distinction between what is a woman from gender. So sex and gender are different concepts. I think that's a nice place to start a conversation.
Yeah. So what do you think about this definition? I think it's especially prevalent in the high school and college of an ideal woman, of a stereotypical ideal woman. Where do you think that came from, or where that root is?
I think stereotyping about ideal women or ideal men is extraordinarily limiting both to women and to men.
Yeah.
I want to start with an ideal man. If you think an ideal man is strong and never cries, and never shows weakness and never shows indecision, you're forcing men to miss some of the great joys in this world. If you force a woman to live up to what used to be the ideal womanhood, which was being submissive and making sure that they made the men around them happy, and fulfilled domestic roles, you're certainly limiting women. But I think the new part of this conversation that people are just beginning to realize is that when you stereotype women, almost by definition you also stereotype men.
Yeah.
And you do damage to both. You just don't hurt women, you hurt men too. I think men are beginning to wake up to the fact that they're hurting themselves.
Yeah. How do you think media and advertisements and just modern technology has added to this stereotype or has taken away from it?
I think technology is a double-edged sword in the sense that some of the STEM technologies, some of the internet technologies are great equalizers. Because you have no idea if a great web designer is a man or a woman. All you see is the great web design, right?
Yeah.
You don't really know, depending on how they choose to label themselves, if a great blogger is a man or a woman. Did we know that J.K. Rowling was a woman until she came out and said she was a woman?
Yeah.
From her initials, no. So technology is a great leveler. On the other hand, there are parts of technologies which are really dangerous toward gender equality. And I'm thinking about the harassment and the bullying that goes online, and the shaming and the body image stuff that goes on online.
Okay.
So technology is neither good nor bad. It's how we use it.
Yeah. What about institutions like this one or like schools? How do you think they're dealing with gender issues or gender roles?
That's a great question. I wish I could turn the camera on you and ask you what your school's doing about it. We'll do that offline. But I think that institutions have a responsibility to grow and to really do their damnedest to promote diversity in all its forms. And I don't mean a human rights argument. I mean here a sort of an economic / productivity argument. There's been some pretty good research done around the world that shows that diverse firms that have women in senior management, that have women on their boards, tend to outperform less diverse firms. They have better return on equity. You don't need to be a sort of a card-carrying feminist to want a higher return on your equity if you're a stockholder of a firm. Why do diverse firms outperform less diverse firms? They do it because the more diverse firms have more creative ideas, more diverse opinions. They more mirror their consumers, and so they're better able to figure out what their consumers want. So I think it's in organizations' best interests to promote diversity. And if you look at sort of the best organizations in the United States and around the world, they're doing that.
Yeah.
It's the really traditional organizations that I think are falling behind.
And what would you say are some of the easiest ways of implementing diversity? Things that, even someone who's just making a club or a committee at school could do to increase the diversity in that?
That's a great question. So I think you can increase diversity in clubs by asking people what they want out of the clubs and asking people that are different than yourself. So I haven't been to BCC, so I don't know what clubs you have there, but I'm sure there are clubs for around sort of occupational interests, like photography clubs, like mechanics clubs.
Yeah.
Probably not mechanics clubs anymore. It's BCC after all, right?
Yeah.
There may be a cooking club. And so if you're forming a cooking club, maybe you want to make an extra effort to get guys into the cooking club and say, well, what do you want to cook? What could we have in this cooking club that would make it interesting for you? What could we have in a drama club that makes people who are usually aren't interested in drama want to participate? So being a little bit, there's really some interesting results. You probably know this, that the sex composition of orchestras in the United States has changed dramatically. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
So 15 or 20 years ago, orchestras were overwhelmingly male. And orchestras sort of wondered why men always won the auditions. Was it because men played the instruments better than women? The evidence is men don't play instruments better than women.
Yeah.
So what orchestras did was to begin having auditions behind screens. So they put up a screen, and the people who were playing to try and get in the orchestra, the judges would have no way to know if they were men or women playing. And that helped a bit.
Yeah.
And then they realized that people were listening to the sound of the shoes behind the screen, and the women wore high heels, and that sound differently than flats.
Yeah.
So then they started asking women to come to the interviews and to the auditions in flats behind the screens. And lo and behold, sex bias in choosing who got into your orchestra disappeared. And now all orchestras, I shouldn't say that, most orchestras in the United States use blind auditions. Didn't happen first on The Voice. Happened first in auditions for orchestras. So the techniques that beyond school clubs, they're techniques which organizations can use in how they interview to make sure that everyone has a fair chance. If you're interviewing for a job, you can make sure that your interview committee looks like the population you want to have in your organization, so you don't have all male interviewing committees. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically you're implying the power of conversation between the person creating the club or the institution and then the people who they want to be part of it.
Yep.
Do you think that's what's lacking predominantly, not only here in the U.S., but also in developing nations, this sort of lack of conversation between government and population?
I don't think it's necessarily a matter of conversation per se. I think it's about what is the conversation about and how is the conversation carried on. And are you empowering different voices to participate in the conversation? I think the key question is who's talking and who's listening, rather than is there some talking going on.
Yeah. If you had a group of young children here, both females and males, what would you tell them that would hopefully impact their life in a way that they would try to be more diverse? If you had to tell them one thing.
Wouldn't tell them anything. I'd show them.
All right, yeah.
I'd show them a management committee where I'm one man and there are two women on my management committee. I'd invite the boys to come into the kitchen and cook with me. I'd invite the girls to do I'd make sure I'd make sure that I was showing a level playing field.
Yeah.
Because I think telling doesn't convince as much as showing does.
All right. Recently at my school there has been this conversation about femininity and masculinity.
Tell me more.
Well, they've been basically talking about how those two terms should be sort of eliminated from conversation. Has been one side, and the other side has been saying, if you eliminate it, then there's no conversation about it. If you were to talk to both sides, what would you say? Would you tell them, yeah, we should eliminate it because it's something that is like pro-stereotypes in some people's eyes? Or no, we should keep it, but we shouldn't enforce it in such a manner where you have to stay?
That is an absolutely great question. I would urge you and your friends and colleagues at school to go to look at a website for an NGO called Promundo.
Mm-hmm.
They've worked in Brazil and they've worked around the world. You can't, I don't think outlawing conversations makes sense.
Yeah.
But what Promundo has done is to engage boys and girls in conversations, and young men and young women in conversations about what it means to be a young man and what it means to be a young woman.
Yeah.
And the young men and young women are talking to each other and helping redefine what that means.
Yeah.
So Promundo in Brazil has convinced that being a young man doesn't mean you can't cry, doesn't mean you have to be tough, and above all, doesn't mean that you need to show violence toward a young woman in a relationship.
Yeah.
And Promundo, by having these conversations between young men and young women, has decreased the rates of dating and violence in dating relationships, and has increased the use of contraceptives and safe sex among
Yeah.
among young people who are having sex.
Yeah.
So I think that having the conversation is absolutely essential, and you can have a conversation in a structured way so that you offer both young men and young women the chance to change.
In the workplace, do you still think the idea of stereotypes is prevalent, especially in an institution like this where, at least personally, I've seen both females and males and people of different races and religions be in high-level positions? Do you still think it's an issue, or do you think it's slowly beginning to change?
I think both things are true. I think it's still an issue and it's beginning to change. This institution, the American Development Bank, set a goal of having 40% of its senior managers being women. We set that goal in 2010, and we hope to achieve it by 2015. I think when we started, the percentage was 28% of women in top management. We didn't get to the goal.
Yeah.
We got to 37%. By the way, your mom counted in that statistic. I don't know if you wanted me to say that on video or not. We can do that again without your mom reference.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no.
But that didn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
Change happens by setting goals and by taking concrete actions to get to the goals. And presumably when we get to 40%, we'll celebrate it, and then we'll set the goal at 45% and have at it again.
Yeah. Do you think that when making these types of goals, it should be representative of the population of the country you're living in, or it should be this 50-50?
Do you know of any country where it isn't 50-50?
I mean, maybe not gender, but I know for certain things like
For race.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. It
Yeah.
needs to be realistic, and it needs to mirror populations.
Yeah, all right, yeah. Just double checking, because there's definitely, that is another side of the story that's starting to be looked at, especially.
In fact, there are countries where it isn't 50-50.
Yeah.
There are countries like China, which are like 52-48.
Yeah.
And they have those out-of-whack ratios in case of China and some of the countries in the Indian subcontinent because of sex-selective abortion.
Yeah. Yeah. When I don't know if you are aware, but there are certain online sort of trends, such as...
Educate me, please.
Yeah, so like online body trends. So the A4 challenge is basically you take a piece of A4 paper and you put it up, and if you can see your waist on either side, you've like lost the challenge. Or the thigh gap, which is like you have a gap when you put both of your feet together between your legs, which is, to be honest, medically not recommended.
Very healthy.
Yeah, it's not healthy. Where do you think this is coming from the youth, or, how does this change from, your generation?
You've made me think with that question.
Yeah.
a while back you asked me about technology. And this, I think, is an example of technology really being dangerous for some types of gender equality because of bullying, because of body image shaming,
Yeah.
and things like that. I think that in some sense it's easier to bully and to body shame now for this generation than it was for my generation.
Yeah.
Because you under body shame in my generation, you sort of needed to tell someone to someone's face. And of
Yeah.
course people did that all the time,
Yeah.
but you couldn't do it on an industrial scale.
Yeah.
Now you can do it on an industrial scale. So I think that, I mean, obviously the answer isn't, oh, gee, we should abolish chat rooms, right?
Yeah.
That isn't what we should do. But we need to use technology in smart ways. And so, for example, I think a really smart way is what Emma Watson has done
Mhm.
with her He for She campaign.
Yeah.
And to try and make it, if you will, sexy for young men to be supportive of young women,
Mhm.
and for older men to be supportive of older women.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right that technology, and I had never heard of the A4.
Yeah.
I had never heard of the A4. That's just frightening.
I mean, that's the thing with, like, sometimes talking to my mom.
Yeah.
You see how goals, when it comes to gender issues, sometimes only apply to a generation. Or not only apply, but are more pinpointed
Mm-hmm.
for a certain generation. And I think it's clear that each generation has their issue with, all of them have an issue with gender, but each one have specific knacks that are unseen to the previous one.
So, can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
that? I think many young women in the United States, anyway, think that feminism is an ugly word.
Yeah.
And they think, in large part, I think that feminism is an ugly word because they don't see inequalities. They think the playing field is level, and they think this is an issue for their parents' generation, not for theirs.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I agree with the feminist movement, and I think I agree that we're not equal, and I don't think this is just for the older generation. I think it's still prevalent today, and I know that because I've experienced it.
Mm.
And I've experienced it not only with people of my culture, but of people with different cultures, different ages. So it's still very prevalent. What I see with young feminists, which I don't approve of, is how they make it so extreme. They make it to a level where it's like we have to hate men.
Mm.
And that's not what the feminist movement is about. And so when I see that done, it's not that I disapprove the feminist movement. I disapprove how they're making it sort of the same. They're fighting for equality, but then they're saying we have to hate
They're
the
making
other
it a
side.
zero-sum game, in other
Exactly.
words.
And so I think it's wrong to not support feminism to a certain extent, but I think it also has to be in a controlled way.
So in other words, you could like Emma Watson's brand of feminism,
Exactly.
where she brings the men in
Yeah.
rather than telling them that they're the enemy.
Because you can't fight for equality by also pushing kind of for inequality, in a sense of you can't push for women to be on top of men or men to be on top of women, because both are just as wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be where everyone has to work together. Because if not, then both sides are stuck in their own thoughts and aren't willing to look at it either side.
Can we stop on that? I think you
Yeah.
summed it up beautifully.
Thank you.
This was one of the